네, 감사합니다. 제가 보니까 그 질문이 여기 그 기자분들도 많으시고 또 학자분들도 많으시기 때문에 플로우에서 되게 좋은 질문들이 많이 나올 것 같아요. 그래서 일단은 저희가 여기서 할 질문들은 각자가 할 질문들은 한 개 정도로 저희가 리밋을 하고 그 다음에 되도록이면 많은 시간을 여러분들에게 드리도록 하겠습니다. So thank you very much for the nice presentation in the whole afternoon, Professor Beckett, Mr. Kung. I just realized that Mr. Kung graduated U.S. University of Southern California Annenberg School, where I was a professor for 10 years. So he graduated around time that when I was a junior faculty member there. It's very nice. And also Professor Beckett at SE, School of Media and Communication. One of my colleagues was there, Sarah Bonner-Weiser. So she was my colleague at Annenberg at the time. Anyway, it's very nice to see these people here. This is a great opportunity because we have these journalists, journalism scholars, communication technology scholars here. So I think we can share a lot of insight today. So the order of the question is that we have Dr. Oh from Korea Press Foundation. Dr. Oh did not have a chance to ask questions to Professor Beckett or Mr. Kung. So I'm going to give a chance to Dr. Oh to ask questions first.
예, 저는 한국어로 하겠습니다. 예, 다들 영어로 하셔가지고 좀 부담스럽네요. 예, 저는 한국어로 하겠고요. 너무 두 분 발표 너무 잘 들었고 사실은 저는 이제 토론자기 때문에 프레젠테이션 파일을 미리 받아보고 특히 백켓 교수님이 그 저널리즘 AI 보고서도 이미 본 상태여서 계속 좀 직접 뵙게 돼서 꼭 사진을 한번 남겨야겠다 생각도 하고 있습니다. 예, 사실은 제가 이 강연을 들으면서 두 분의 강연을 들으면서 몇 가지의 실험을 하고 있었습니다. 뭘 했냐면은 첫 번째 백켓 교수님 발언 그 강연 내용과 대답 내용을 그대로 녹취를 했습니다. 녹취를 한 다음에 한국에는 네이버가 있습니다. 클로바 노트에 가서 영어 풀텍스트를 내려받았습니다. 그 풀텍스트 내려받은 파일을 그 내용을 그 텍스트 파일로 만든 다음에 그 텍스트 파일을 챗GPT의 그 어드밴스드 데이터 애널리시스에 올렸습니다. 그리고 그 내용을 요약해 달라고 요청을 했습니다. 영어로 요약을 했고요. 영어로 요약한 내용을 다시 또 정리를 해가지고 챗GPT에게 이걸 바탕으로 해서 보고서를 써달라고 부탁을 했습니다. 한국어로 써달라고 했습니다. 그리고 그 내용을 또 바탕으로 해서 이거를 기사로 만들어 달라고 부탁을 했습니다. 그 내용들을 몇몇 사람들하고 공유를 했는데요. 잘 썼습니다. 네. 몇몇 단어들만 고치면 바로 발행이 가능할 정도로 잘 써진 내용이었고요. 그리고 두 번째 실험을 또 했습니다. 어떤 실험이었냐면은 저희는 이제 토론자기 때문에 미리 파일을 받았다고 먼저 말씀을 드렸는데요. 그래서 쿵 매니저님의 발표 자료 PPT 파일을 챗GPT에게 줬습니다. 준 다음에 자, 이 내용을 바탕으로 보고서를 써달라. 근데 한쪽 부분, 그러니까 지역 로컬 언론들의 사례들을 잘 해석을 못하더라고요. 거기서 제가 또 다시 지시를 했습니다. 이 사례는 이런 의미가 있으니 이걸 보강해서 다시 쓰고 하나하나 지정을 해서 다 보강을 했더니 또 그럴듯한 내용이 나왔습니다. 그래서 이 내용을 바탕으로 기사를 만들어줘라 라고 부탁을 했습니다. 그대로 써도 될 정도로 잘 나왔습니다. 아까 이제 그 트랜스크립션이라는 전사 문제도 많이 나왔고, 그다음에 실제로 업무 현장에서 어떻게 사용될지 비용이 많이 들어갈 것이다. 그런 여러 가지 문제들이 지적되고 있는데요. 제가 보기에는 그냥 챗GPT 유로 버전만 쓰더라도 웬만한 건 현재 다 가능하다라고 생각하고 있습니다. 그렇게 많은 비용을 들이지 않더라도 기자 업무, 특히 저는 이제 연구자이지만은 굉장히, 그러니까 제가 이런 표현을 쓰는데 저보다 한 10배 멍청한 놈을 비서로 둔 느낌이다라고 저는 얘기를 합니다. 왜냐하면은 제가 하기 싫은 간단한 업무들은 충분히 시켜서 다 부려먹을 수가 있습니다. 자꾸 챗 GPT가 대화형 인터페이스를 갖고 있기 때문에 그 대화하는 도구로 생각하는 경우가 많은 것 같은데요. 대화 도구가 아닙니다. 데이터 처리 도구라고 생각하고 정확하게 일을 시키는 게 중요한데 아직 그 한국 언론사나 한국 언론들이 일을 시키기보다는 자꾸 물어보면서 답을 찾아서 그 답이 틀린 거를 오히려 즐기는 이상한 분위기가 있는데요. 답이 틀리는 거를 즐기셔봤자 답이 점점 좋아진데 기여하실 뿐인데 약간 조금 그런 경향이 있는 것 같습니다. 오히려 데이터 처리 도구로서 활용하면은 지금 쿵 매니저님이 발표하신 사례들에서 한국에서 전부 다 가능한 부분들입니다. 사실 기능 적용하는 거 그렇게 어렵지 않고요. CMS나 그런 데 적용하는 거 어렵지 않은데, 그리고 정말 좋은 것 중에 하나가 한국에는 그리고 아까 제가 그 기사를 썼다는데 GPT가 쓴 기사를 저는 그리고 네이버 클로버 X로 가져갑니다. 이거를 한국어로 더 가다듬어 달라고 요청을 하면 훨씬 더 잘 가다듬어져서 나옵니다. 그리고 뭐 원고지 몇 매로 써라고까지 기가 막히게 알아듣습니다. 그런 식으로 활용할 수 있는 방안들이 있기 때문에 물론 그대로 발행하면 안 됩니다. 사람이 최종적으로 다 검토를 해야 되지만 검토를 해본다면서 최종적으로 검토하면 일단 업무 시간의 상당량을 줄일 수는 있습니다. 그 귀찮은 작업들에. 그래서 아까 잠깐 얘기했는데 제가 오늘 만약 이 행사 내용 전체를 그 기록을 남겨야 된다. 보고서를 써야 되고 기사를 써야 된다면은 저에게 녹취록 혹은 유튜브 영상 파일 혹은 프레젠테이션 파일만 달라. 나머지는 알아서 다 해줄 테니 그것만 있으면 충분히 완성된 버전을 만들 수 있을 것이다라고 얘기를 했었습니다. 저는 그 오늘 행사가 조금 계기가 돼가지고 질문을 드리기보다는 오늘 행사 두 분의 발표 내용이 너무 좋았기 때문에 거기에 대해서 어떤 질문을 드리기보다는 이만큼 많이 다가와 있다라는 것을 우리 언론들이 많이 알았으면 좋겠습니다. 베켓 교수님 발표하신 내용에서 그 다양한 그 인식조사들을 결과들을 볼 수 있었고, 그 다음에 쿵 매니저님의 그 사례들 같은 경우도 이게 충분히 현장에서 적용되고 있는 것들이고 실제로 활용 가능하다는 거. 근데 이거를 왜 활용 가능하지 못하느냐? 제가 마지막 한 마디만 끝냈습니다. 많이 안 써봐서입니다. 생성형 AI 도구들은 쓰기 쉽게 나온 도구입니다. 인공지능이라는 건 원래 와 있었는데 그거를 일반인도 쓰기 쉬운 도구화 시켜준 것이 저는 챗GPT와 같은 대화형 생성형 AI 도구들이라고 생각합니다. 그렇기 때문에 대화가 아니라 이걸 갖고서 내 업무에서 실제로 많이 써보는 일들을 하는 게 가장 중요하다고 생각합니다. 그래야지 이것이 할 수 있는 범위와 하지 못하는 범위에 대해서 정확히 알 거라고 생각합니다. 근데 안 써보고 그냥 대략 이런 거 있다. 아까 쿵 매니저님 발표 내용에서 가능한 부분, 불가능한 부분들이 계속 적시가 되어서 나왔었는데요. 그거는 실험을 통해서만 확인할 수 있습니다. 그건 실험이라는 건 뭐냐면은 생활에서 많이 쓰는 것이라고 생각합니다. 제가 너무 많은 시간을 잡아먹는데 이만 마치겠습니다.
Any answer from you or you?
Absolutely, I cannot disagree with anything Dr. Oh has said. I want to add, of course, that that is an important message, the need to experiment. Even when you fail, you learn lessons from that. And so failure from a news management standpoint should be tolerated as long as lessons are learned. Unfortunately, in the realities of news organizations these days, in news organizations that are extraordinarily financially constrained, having a high-profile failure, unfortunately, it could be quite destructive, and so it is a conundrum, unfortunately, to be able to try to resolve that. Yes, we want to be able to experiment, but in some cases, a failure may not be economically feasible for some news organizations. So.
Yeah, just wanted to add that well done, because if you managed to get the AI to make sense of my talk, I'm very impressed. I think that's remarkable. I think Ernest is quite right about the risk balance when you're trying to do experiments. I think in this case, there was no risk. You know, in your case of doing that with our talk, there was no risk. You didn't go and rush and publish it. You know, so I think that's a really good example of working through a system that can then be replicated. And as probably people know who have been doing, for example, you know, product development or CMS development over the last few years, this is not a sort of spontaneous exercise. You described a process there that was carefully thought through at each stage, and you adjusted according to what the results were at each stage, which is exactly the way that you should do this. So developing these experiments or developing these tools is a formal system. You need to think about how you're going to manage the process, and there's lots of advice from people out there, Ernest has done tremendous work around this. So just go and look at any of the kind of development work that AP has done. Again, it's kind of exemplary, and I think minimizes risk and maximizes the opportunity.
Thank you for the answer. So now the next order is Mr. Kim. You had a chance to ask questions to Mr. Kung. This time, do you have any question to Professor Beckett?
Yes, thank you. I would like to ask you one brief question. I'm just wondering if it is really possible for us to teach what is newsworthy and what is not to machine, because I'm just wondering, so we cannot tell which has a news value and which is not, based on statistical pattern or the statistical correlation. So because there is always kind of the newsworthy things like Black Swan, to be more specific, like alien invasion or another pandemic, stuff like that. Then how can machine can tell such a thing as a newsworthy? So I'm just wondering, how can we to cope with this issue?
I mean, I think there's a limit to it. That's why I keep saying that judgment thing is perhaps the ultimate editorial responsibility that you want to retain. However, it is actually possible to do it to a degree. I would cite the example I would give, and this is pre-generative AI. Swedish radio developed something they called the public service algorithm, and they used an AI program to help them to plan the running orders for their local radio stations. Each one was slightly different because they're in different places, in different interests in those particular places. So what they did was whenever there was a story, they assigned certain values to it. It could be very important, or or the type of story, and then they let the algorithm decide the running order for those different stations, and then of course they reviewed it afterwards, and they found it was really interesting. They said, first of all, it did a really good job, but also it actually sometimes did things they thought, oh, that's clever. I wouldn't have done that, but they're right. The algorithm's right. And that's one of the most fascinating things we've done in our project when we've been working with journalists, when they've been experimenting, is actually using the AI to counter human bias. Journalists might think something's really exciting and interesting because they've been working on it for years, but actually the audience doesn't care at all. They were much more interested in this other thing that you've been ignoring. And AI can be really good at surfacing stories, for example, and correcting the bias. And some of the bias, for example, we had one project a few years ago where a team were working on trying to counter the sort of gender bias in the newsroom. And this was a tool that a version of this was developed by the Financial Times at one point, I think, where it was the AI was monitoring the gender of the images being used in the paper and also the sources for the stories. And all it did was it told the news editor, hey, have you noticed you're not using enough women? So it's just a way of helping to correct the bias, if you like, of the humans. So I think it works both ways, but ultimately, of course, there's something about your identity as a news organization or as a journalist, and that's a human thing.
I'll add specifically that example is what we were trying to tackle in the WFMZ TV project, the final project. I'll tell you a little bit about the result of that project. In the initial few weeks that the TV station had to play around with it, again, we had 3 buckets that the AI did class emails into. Worthy, meaning going to the calendar, unsure, or not worthy. They can see all 3 categories. They're able to see all 3 categories, how the results go in. So they did say the AI was putting in more items than they would normally consider newsworthy. It was classifying more emails. It had more false positives in the worthy. However, in the couple weeks they had to test, they went through the not worthy and unsure categories. Not a single email that they encountered actually belonged in Worthy. So the model to them worked extraordinarily well. That said, to teach newsworthiness, they've been trying to adapt to using the system, to having the system as a tool. Again, the original goal was about time savings. So instead of looking at every email that comes in for an event, they only need to focus their attention now on the unsure and not worthy. So the human no longer has to go through the main worthy because it was already done by the AI. So we did save them time, but there are going to be items in unsure or not worthy eventually that are your black swans, that they are incredibly good stories that the AI won't catch because the AI was trained over a certain amount of time, only 5,000 emails, and so that couldn't possibly comprise everything that would be considered newsworthy. So we did try to protect a little bit against bias, as Professor Beckett was talking about. They chose 5 assignment editors to mark up emails. It wasn't just one person was doing it. We did 5 people. And so it's just 5 people marking up emails that hopefully reduces some of the inherent bias of any specific person. The other bit of that was, it actually goes to explanation of the accuracy, the false positives. I was actually asked whether it could be even more accurate to have fewer false positives. I said probably not, because you had 5 people train the system, 5 people mark up emails. If you gave all 5 people the same email, do you think they would make the same decision? And they thought about it, they said no. So it's that there are limits to how well newsworthiness algorithm can work.
Okay, so this is question to Mr. Kung because I didn't have a chance to ask a question to you. I noticed that you have a very interesting background, spanning from news producer, writer, and then currently AI product manager. And also, during the presentation, you demonstrate how these AI systems, CMS systems, can gather newsworthy items and generate news automatically. So based on all this, based on your personal background and your demonstration, my question is about the ontology of journalists. So based on your personal interest, personal history, in the demonstration, who are journalists in the age of AI? Is journalist a storyteller who writes an interesting story? Or is a journalist, curator, who collects interesting or personalized information tailored to the news audience? Or is a journalist simply an information trader who trades information with added value? Or is journalist, like the traditional definition of journalist, is journalist gatekeeper who decides what to share with the public? So in the age of AI, who are journalists? So that's the question. This question is also very much related to the question to Professor Beckett that I asked earlier. What is news in the age of AI? Is it fact? Is it story? Is it information? What's the difference between news and information, news and story, and news and fact? And then if you know this origin of the English word fact, the word fact appeared in English dictionary 100 years after the invention of printing press, which means, I think this is the question that you should answer. But anyway, even the word fact is kind of an invention caused by a technology. So from that perspective, maybe you can share some insight about ontology of journalists and the meaning of journalism.
About the ontological meaning of journalism, that is an extraordinarily challenging question for me, and I don't think I would have done well in your class. But I will say this. Journalists, I have been asked similar questions in a different way. But what separates journalism from anybody who's just writing a story, who's just writing a blog? What separates us these days? One big thing is our credibility. We, as a journalism organization, we have not just our own personal credibility, the organization's credibility, plus we abide by professional ethics, which is not something any blogger does. And it's beyond that too, right? Because we have content creators on social media, TikTokers, influencers, who in the U.S. it's extremely popular. There are movie reviews on social media, on TikTok, Instagram, and those people are paid by the studios to review those, but people think that they are just like any other reviewer, whereas a professional movie reviewer has ethics to follow, and they have professional guidelines. So what differs, how are journalists different in the age of AI is it's also tied very much to how are journalists different in the age of just digital media, where anybody can create content. So it's an extraordinarily broad question. I don't believe I'll have the best answer, but I do think our credibility sets us apart then in the age of AI. If we use AI irresponsibly, we jeopardize that credibility. And so that is probably the biggest thought that I think should be going through people's minds about journalism, the future of journalism and AI. I'll attempt to answer a little bit about what is news in the age of AI. I think the newsworthiness, news is still, it hasn't changed in that we have a professional standard, an industry-wide standard of what is news, an organizational value of what is news, along with personal values of what is news. We have that hierarchy, that framework. That, I don't believe, changes in the age of AI. But again, it is the same thing, where AI, if used incorrectly or irresponsibly, jeopardizes what people consider news. Anything can be, almost anything right now we've seen can be, from words to images to video in the future, will be generated by AI. And so why is that output different than an output generated by a human journalist? These are very big questions. And what defines us, our content, from others? There was one example that was mentioned earlier about illustrations or photos that go for news. What is a news photograph? We had an interesting encounter with one local news organization. It's actually in California, in a remote part of California. They've never had enough money in the budget to hire an artist to illustrate stories. And they have taken to using DALL-E, OpenAI's DALL-E, to generate illustrations for their stories. So they have limited photo abilities at that newsroom, but instead of hiring a human artist to illustrate a story, they've decided to do that. And that ties into this, that there are clearly uses of AI that we didn't anticipate that, but it makes sense. Yeah.
Okay, thank you for the insightful answer, and sorry for the difficult question. So now we have time for 2 questions from the floor. So I'll just leave it open to the floor. So any questions? Please, here.
더 PR의 김경탁 기자입니다. 이 오늘 컨퍼런스는 사실은 뉴스를 만드는 사람의 입장에서의 이야기들인데 좀 들으면서 약간 회의감이 든 게 지금 뉴스 유통이라는 측면에서 보면 사실 그러니까 페이스북이 요즘 그 어떤 언론사 뉴스 같은 걸 거의 다 빼는 그런 정책을 펴고 있고 그리고 특정 이슈에 집중되지 않도록 뭐 알고리즘이 바뀌었다 이런 얘기들도 나오고 있는데 보면 그런 생각이 들더라고요. 그러니까 가짜 뉴스들, 그러니까 생성형 AI로 만든 이미지를 쓰지 않는다라고 하는 원칙이 사실은 페이스북이라는 어떤 플랫폼 안에서는 그러니까 우리는 복싱룰로 싸워야 되는데 상대방은 무규칙 이종격 투기하는 상대랑 싸워야 되는 상황인 거예요. 그러면 이게 이 플랫폼이 그 마음을 바꾸면 언론사들이 도저히 살아남기가 어려운 상황인데 이거에 대해서 어떤 사회적인 좀 어떤 조치를 할 수 있는 가능성이라든가 뭐 그런 거에 대한 좀 의견이 있으신지 좀 궁금합니다.
God, I refer you to a report that I published back in 2018 when we looked at this question. You know, so this is an issue that's been around about how do you, or should you even, regulate the platforms? And the basic answer was yes, you can, of course. You can regulate anything if you want to, but that it's going to be extraordinarily difficult, partly because all the platforms are different and they don't even stay the same. They evolve and people use them in very different ways. And of course, then there are differences between different countries about what your expectation is going to be of what would be good. So we proposed that that the most important thing was not to regulate the content, because that's virtually impossible, to regulate all the content all the time. The only way to do that would be to have pre-publication regulation. Forget it. That would be the end of social media overnight, and that would be terrible. But there are things you can do around transparency and about accountability. So you can have a system whereby when something does go wrong, when there's content that is clearly false or harmful, and I think harmful is a better judgment, that there is a system in place. And at the moment we don't have that transparency because the platforms have actually reversed. They're giving us less access than before to their algorithms and to their content and to their moderation processes. What I would say, though, is a huge warning that what you want to regulate is going to be different to what she wants to regulate. And I think it's good. There's a real danger as well of capture, that any regulatory process, if it's in the hands of the wrong people, will be used to suppress freedom of expression and so on. We also know that from our experience of moderation on social media, that it's just not very simple. There are some things, we have laws already for defamation, well, most countries do. We have laws for defamation. In the UK, we also have laws, for example, against hate speech. You're not allowed to advocate violence against people. Those are laws. So you can apply the law to anything. You don't need special regulation to do that. It's just a question of going to court or getting the police out. But my worry is, I think that the problem is the opposite. In the world today, I think the problem is the closing down of platforms and so on. So I think as journalists especially, we should be sensible about this. If you close down every newspaper that published something that was wrong, there wouldn't be any newspapers left, So I think that we have to be realistic and accept a degree at least of problematic content online, frankly.
Do we have a time for one more question, or should we finish it now? Can I take one more question? Is it okay? So it's one more question, but it should be quick, and the answer should be a little bit quick. Okay, so anyone who did not ask any questions today?
네, 베켓 교수님께 한번 여쭤보고 싶은데요. 조금 약간 그 다른 주제로 들리실 수도 있겠지만, 그 언론이라는 것은 어떻게 본다면은 권력을 언제나 감시하는 와치독 역할을 계속 해왔고, 그에 못지않게 권력도 언론을 계속해서 견제하는 그런 역할을 해왔었는데, 그렇지 않아도 지금 어떻게 본다면은 자본이라든지 아니면은 미디어 디지털 플랫폼이라든지 그런 정부의 권력에 의해서 미디어가 통제를 당하는 그런 미디어 캡처 현상이 계속해서 일어나고 있는데, 바꿔서 얘기하면 이 AI가 인공지능이 역시 AI도 미디어 캡처의 그런 일을 수행할 것인지, 그다음에 만약에 미디어 캡처에 위협이 있다면, 그 인공지능의 미디어 캡처에 위협이 있다면 저널리스트들은 여기에 대해서 어떻게 또 대응을 해 나가야 될 것인지 한번 의견을 여쭙고 싶습니다.
I talked about technological dependency, so I think there's that element of it. But no, I think that the threats to journalistic freedom and independence are all about humans. They're about politicians who use lawyers. It's about corporations who use lawyers and other devices. You know, they send people around with guns. You know, they use the courts to shut down particular journalists or particular news organizations. This has got very little to do with technology. Yes, you can use the tech. You know, we've seen it where people are using the tech, even in the UK, to monitor. Where a disgraceful example recently, where British police were using technology to monitor what journalists were doing, which was appalling. But that's a decision by human police to do that, and they shouldn't do it. So I think there's a real AI is not going to preserve press freedom at all, but neither do I think it's particularly going to be a problem. I think the real problems, we shouldn't be distracted by the tech. The real problems around the world are about human actors putting pressure on journalists, and journalists are weak not because of technology, but they're weak because they often don't have the money, they don't have the resources to fight back, or they don't have the capability. You know, the threat is so dangerous. You know, the threat to your income, for example, let alone your freedom. In so many countries, media is directly or indirectly indebted, you know, to people in power. And this has always been the case, but perhaps we're more vulnerable now because of the financial weakness that the news media is suffering from.
Yeah, I think it's about time to wrap up the session. Thank you very much. If you have more questions, you can ask questions during this coffee break out there. So we'll be available. So please come to us if you have more questions. Thank you.
네, 감사합니다.